All right, and hello guys. We are here for another discussion, a atheist discussion with me, your host, Cameron Bertuzzi. I'm a blogger, I'm a photographer, and actually just got a text that we haven't started. We were having some technical difficulties, so if you guys can just bear with us, we're still waiting on one of our guys to show up. Benjamin, he's just having some trouble there, so but we're gonna go ahead and get started here. So again, I'm Cameron. I'm a photographer, blogger. I have a real big interest in Christian apologetics. And so what I've been doing recently is organizing these discussions with other apologists, other atheists that are interested in philosophy of religion. And so I've been organizing these together. And today we have a really interesting discussion plan, which is on the argument from Hiddenness. Now we've discussed this once in the past, but this one is going to be a little bit more organized. We have some sort of opening remarks from the atheists that are joining us today. We have Justin Schieber, who is the host or the co-host of Real Atheology. It's a podcast. And we also have Ben Watkins, who is the guy that's having some technical difficulties. He will join us momentarily. But the other theists that we have today with us are Josh Parikh. And I hope I'm saying your last name right.
So it's quarter Indian. I pronounce it Parikh.
Parikh, okay.
Like that might be wrong because like I'm not quite sure it's Gujarat, but like I pronounce it Parikh.
Right, so you don't even know how to pronounce your own name. That's
which
cool.
Is like a really useful thing. Like yeah, I mean it's one of the like that like you get a degree like study philosophy this long and I can't even pronounce my own name. Like nice. It's a good stuff. It's good stuff to do. Cool. So yeah.
Yeah. So in addition to Josh Parikh, we have Blake Giunta. That's another name. That am I pronouncing that right? Your mic is muted, Blake. There we go.
I said it's Italian. It's Giunta.
Giunta. Excuse me. My last name is Bertuzzi, and I don't even pronounce it the Italian way. So, Giunta. All right, guys. Well, let's go ahead and get started. And I don't see Ben's mic or anything, but we're going to go ahead and open up the floor to Justin, and we're going to allow him to go ahead and lay out the basic structure of the argument. Maybe give us some of the context of where we are in the argument, philosophy of religion, who some of the key players are, like J.L. Schellenberg, and so we're going to go ahead and open it to him while we're waiting on Benjamin. So, Justin, take the floor. Your mic is muted. There we go. I can hear you.
We good now?
We are good.
Okay. Could someone just throw the link in to Ben again real quick? He seems to be having some trouble in Facebook Messenger. Anyways,
yeah, no problem.
So the divine hiddenness argument, I don't know if we want to talk about context before I get into the argument, specifically Schellenberg's version of it. But the general thought is that, God seems to be hidden from us. Obviously, you can see insights about this in like the Psalms, for example, going back throughout history. Nietzsche has a couple comments on it. It's an old idea, but it has yet, well, it had only recently been really kind of formulated in a way that's kind of rigorous and allows itself for good critical examination. And so in 1993, John Schellenberg wrote this book, Divine Hiddenness and Human Reason, which you can see here. And he, as I said, he kind of formalizes the general intuition behind this idea.
And by the way, I definitely invited Schellenberg on to the show, or Shelley, as we like to call him in the business. I invited him onto the show. I see Josh laughing over there. So I invited him on the show, but he gracefully declined. That would have been awesome. But we have our second best here, Justin Schieber. So continue. Sorry.
So here's the general layout of the argument. The divine hiddenness is an argument or family of arguments against the existence of God, which appeals to certain forms of non-belief that exist in the actual world. And as I said, the most popular form of this argument is called divine hiddenness, and it was crafted by Canadian philosopher J.L. Schellenberg. And so hopefully Ben will be able to be joining us soon, but we're going to be presenting and defending the brief version of that argument that Schellenberg lays out in his most recent book, The Hiddenness Argument, a philosophy's new challenge to belief in God. So
okay, I'm just going to interrupt there. That like this isn't just the hiddenness argument. This is sent specifically to you, I believe, by J.L. Schellenberg, and I think there's a signature in the front of that from Schellenberg. Is that right?
yes, there is actually.
Yeah.
So let me show you here. I've got some nice commentary by Mr. Shelley. Okay, so conditional inform, the very first premise of the argument reads as follows. If a perfectly loving God exists, then there exists a God who is always open to personal relationship with any finite person. So theism posits an all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly loving God, but here we should want to ask what it would mean for a being to be perfectly loving. What kinds of things would perfect love ensure? So if we were to ask enough people, there would be disagreement, of course, on the exact details of what this would mean. But of course, that doesn't mean that we can't say anything about the topic. What does seem to be clear about our concept of perfect love is that love is relational and self-giving. Love goes beyond mere benevolence and toward a desire to be personally related and involved with another for its own sake. Now, of course, loving persons will also be open to personal relationship with those that they love because of the various ways in which the well-being of those involved may stand to benefit from such a relationship. And by well-being here, I don't mean to imply, a kind of hedonistic, pleasure-filled life. Rather, we're talking about the deep goods of life. Such as moral or spiritual maturity, for example. Now, the phrase personal relationship here need not be thought of as anything too mysterious or vague. It can be taken to mean that what we all assume it means, which is a relationship between at least two persons mutually interacting in a conscious and meaningful way. So this is the kind of gold standard of relationship. An unsurpassably loving person would not settle for kind of mere perceptions of relationship by one participant where mutual interactions are merely apparent. Now, the use of the word open in this first premise doesn't have to suggest anything other than not being closed to such a relationship. So insofar as one is not themselves positively resisting or preventing such a relationship from taking place, they qualify as open in the term that this argument employs. Now, stating that a perfectly loving God would always be open to personal relationship with finite persons then is merely saying that a perfectly loving God would never do anything herself to close off relationship with finite persons. So as Schellenberg writes, openness to relationship, as the argument understands it, does not require that God do any particular thing to pursue relationship, suffocating us with attention or even politely asking for it. It's compatible with God standing back, as it were, and giving finite creatures some responsibility for how the relationship will develop, or even experientially, or even being elusive when creatures respond presumptuously or complacently, for example. In speaking of the initial plausibility of this premise, Schellenberg writes, how could God at some time count as loving John or Joan as fully and richly as God can, if God at that time is preventing John or Joan from being able to participate in any way in a meaningful conscious relationship with God?
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Excellent.
I can hear you.
So I guess I'll pick up here since I just kind of got in.
Perfect.
Justin gave the first premise of the argument. And so we can take the consequent of that argument and make a move to the second premise, which is if there exists a God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person, then no finite person is ever non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. So notice that the consequent from 1 serves as the antecedent for 2. Given that the relationship referred to in 1 is the kind of thing which requires both parties to believe each other exists. In other words, belief is a causally necessary condition. Premise 2 is an essential part of the hiddenness argument. Schellenberg writes, quote, "Without resistance causing non-belief, a loving God's openness to relationship would be such as to ensure that belief in God was never lost." Note that God's perpetual openness to personal relationship with finite persons is logically consistent with some or even all of the potential relationships never actually coming to fruition, or coming to fruition only after some time. Obviously, then, the additional variable relevant here is the openness of the finite persons towards such a relationship. Conscious and meaningful relationships are a two-way street. And so, of course, the question of whether God will actually have a relationship with any particular finite person cannot be answered just by recognizing that God, if perfectly loving, would be open to it. Finite persons are free to fail to take the opportunity if they so choose. As Schellenberg beautifully writes, quote, "The presence of God will be for them like a light. However much the degree of its brightness may fluctuate, remains on unless they close their eyes."
And so then we find ourselves at a conclusion which follows inescapably from 1 and 2, and that is premise 3, or conclusion 3. Therefore, if a perfectly loving God exists, then no finite person is ever non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. But here is where the problem for theism arises. We are entitled to an additional premise, but this premise directly challenges the consequent of the conclusion that we've met so far in 3.
And that's that.
And so this is
So this is premise 4, and that's the premise that at least some finite persons have been non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. In other words, non-resistant non-believers exist. In defense of this most obvious premise, Schellenberg writes, quote, "Anyone with some acquaintance with evolutionary history and a willingness to look the truth in the eye will be able to see that in the actual world, many people in our history have failed to believe in God without resistance to God in any way coming into the explanation of their non-belief." End quote. And so I think it's important at this point to establish some examples of what we mean by non-resistant non-believers. Again, non-resistant non-believers are open to having a relationship with God. In fact, they may even desire it, but they are unable to have such a relationship because they do not believe that God exists. For example, former believers were already on the right religious path, in a relationship with God, and a loss of belief has terminated that relationship. Additionally, lifelong seekers try to find out where they belong and are open to finding and being found by a divine parent without ever achieving that goal. And finally, isolated non-theists, such as Amazonian tribesmen, have never been in a position to resist belief because they've never even had the idea of a monotheistic God. Consequently, isolated non-theists unavoidably live their entire lives within the influence of a fundamentally misleading system of religious value and meaning. And so at that point, with that premise in place, it follows that therefore no perfectly loving God exists.
All right. So how do you guys feel about the presentation so far? Is there any other things you guys want to add, Justin and Ben, before we turn it over to Josh and Blake?
I think that insofar as we've presented it so far, I think that any additional details are probably best left to kind of unfold as objections start to come in. What we've made clear here are a number of key things. What the argument is not saying is that God would, as a reaction to non-resistant non-believers, as a reaction to their existence, that he would then at that point provide them with evidence so that they could change into non-resistant believers. That's not what the argument is saying. Rather, the argument is saying that God would simply provide at all times in which a person is non-resistantly in a state of non-belief, he would provide them, or I'm sorry, when people are in that state of non-resistance, that they would have belief, that they would have causally sufficient reasons to believe, so that there simply is no at ever any time a person who is both non-resistantly and non-believing with regard to the existence of God. So that's an important thing, because I think a lot of people kind of misinterpret this as God looking around, noticing that there are non-resistant non-believers, and then as a reaction to their existence, providing them with evidence. That's not what the argument is saying, and I think that's a key point. But I think that this is a perfectly good time to discuss some of the potential objections to Schellenberg's argument.
Okay,
Well,
so
I would also want to emphasize that this approach is a top-down approach. So it starts with the concept of God. And so I think that's a point that sometimes gets overlooked, in that we're starting with a perfectly loving God. And so we're the properties and the attributes that we attribute to God constrain the way the world can be, if there is a being with those kinds of properties. And so when we think about perfect love, we have to think of the greatest, the deepest love that could possibly be realized. So there isn't some other good that is better than this. This is the deepest axiological claim that can be made when we say God is unsurpassably loving. And so from there, it follows in a series of steps. And so one of the objections that you get is that we're projecting our own concept of love onto God. And I don't think that's right. I think we're starting, instead of from a bottom-up approach, we're starting from a top-down approach. We're starting with the idea of God and thinking about what follows logically from that concept.
All right, yeah, I want to go ahead and turn it over to our theists. But first, let's go ahead and just sort of run back through the argument. And look at each premise individually, see if there's any objections that Josh and Blake want to raise. So let's look at the first premise. If a perfectly loving God exists, then there exists a God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person. And so what Justin was explaining was that when it says always open, that means that person is not positively trying to inhibit a personal relationship with that person. That sounds like the characterization there of what it means to be always open. Is that correct, Justin?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So Josh or Blake or whoever wants to go first. Don't forget, guys, mute your mic if you're not talking, and then so don't forget to unmute your mic when you're ready to speak. All right.
Do you mind if I start off?
Yeah,
Josh?
I can say a couple of things in clarification. You might want to say something in a sec about objections, but in clarification terms. One thing to note about the argument that's been presented. So in the discussion of the argument from evil over the last 40 to 50 years, there's been a move from what's called the logical problem of evil toward the evidential problem of evil. If you want to know more, you might want to listen to the last Real Atheology, or the second Real Atheology podcast, which discusses the evidential problem of evil. Lots of points for Josh. And so there's what the point is that there's been a move over that time. It's not just saying, so that rather than saying that evil and God are logically incompatible, they're saying something slightly different. They're saying that actually evil is really strong evidence against the existence of God, and that it's probably the case, given the existence of starving children in Africa or dementia or whatever, that God doesn't exist. What's really interesting about the argument, and as has been presented, Ben and Justin are free to push back if they think I'm misinterpreting, but certainly with the way Schellenberg presents it, seems to be actually still really a logical version of the problem of hiddenness. And he's very clear he wants it to be a deductive argument, and saying that it's that hiddenness, or even a state of non-belief for one person ever in existence, is logically incompatible with the existence of God. So it's a really, really strong, he's relying on really strong conceptualizations, or making really strong claims. That's what I mean to say. And he wants to make really bold claims. He's not merely saying that that this is evidence, that it's much stronger than that. And I think that's really important as we go at premises of the argument that we might have, that I probably object to every premise in the argument, but we can go into bits.
Well, presumably presumably you wouldn't object to the conclusion, right? Well, that just follows from the premises if the premises are true. So it's just the premises of the argument, right?
Sorry.
But Blake, let's go ahead and turn it over to you. Let's turn if you have any clarifications that you wanted to provide, or if you want to just weigh in on that first premise and see what your thoughts are there. Or if you don't have any objections to premise 1, then we can move on to premise 2. I'm going to go ahead and open it up to the floor. Open the floor to you guys.
Yeah, I agree with Josh. There's actually been a mountain of literature published on this argument. I think that the holes have been poked all throughout, and one of the reasons, as Josh pointed out, is that it's such a bold argument, because it's like this logical form. I think the argument can be simplified. I actually think that the way Schellenberg frames it can kind of obscure what he's doing because of the way he uses the word open, which is a way that isn't how we'd normally use it, I don't think. I kind of want to ask if Justin, you want to unmute yourself, or both of you, see if you agree with this. I think this might help bring out what's going on. Start with the claim that obviously, I take that back. Some people disagree with this, but the first premise could be that no God has ensured that everyone believes he exists. That would be an essential part of the argument. No God has ensured that everyone believes he exists.
Sure.
And then the next step would be that means that no God has ensured everyone is able to be in relationship with God just by trying.
Sure.
Okay. And from that means that no perfectly loving God exists. That's the next move.
Yeah, I think, well, obviously you would want to put no perfectly loving God. I agree. Yeah.
And then that in turn means that no all good God exists. And that in turn means God does not exist, at least understood in Western theism,
sure.
The greatest possible being. So let me read through that really quickly, because I think it's the quickest way to understand what the argument is doing and where we want to step in. So no God has ensured that everyone believes he exists. And that means no God has ensured everyone is able to be in relationship with God just by trying. And here's where we're going to disagree, at least one part. And that means no perfectly loving God exists. So you have to understand that is the jump. No God has ensured that everyone believes he exists. That means no God has ensured everyone is able to be in relationship with God just by trying. And that alone means no perfectly loving God exists. And then from there, you ultimately get no God. So I don't know if it would have me on the mic for maybe a little longer than I should be, but I would love to go through a list of what gets called in the problem of evil discussion, theodicies, potential reasons for why God might not reveal himself to individual persons. I can present all of them at once, or we can hit them one at a time, or we can start with one of the stronger ones to facilitate discussion. I'll let y'all pick what the best way to do that is.
Yeah, I think that it might be of best. I mean, rather than list a bunch of objections, it might be good for you to just pick one and to kind of hash out, because I think that once that begins, we're going to be able to kind of fall upon some principles that might also apply to the others.
And I think we should also get really clear on Schellenberg's concept of openness, because he's saying that God, a perfectly loving God, would necessarily be open to relationship to any finite person that he created. And now this could have not been the case. God could have not created persons, and then there would be no problem of divine hiddenness. But because there are finite persons that were created presumably by a loving God, and God would love each of them if he was perfectly loving, then we have this concept of openness. There becomes this problem of hiddenness. And so openness to a relationship doesn't require that God do any particular thing to pursue a relationship, such as, suffocating us with attention or even politely asking for a relationship. Being open in the relevant sense to this argument at a certain time simply means not being closed. It means not through one's own actions or omissions, making it impossible for the other, whom one loves, to participate in personal relationship with one at the time should the other wish to do so. If God is open to relationship, then God sees to it that nothing he does or fails to do puts relationship with himself out of reach for finite persons at the time in question. And this is because love is deeply relational. How could God at some time count as loving someone as fully, deeply, and richly as he can if he at the time is preventing them from being able to participate in any way in a meaningful conscious relationship with God? Such minimal openness seems self-evidently to belong to divine love. So instead of casting it in terms of belief, like was just done, it's casting in terms of God being open, and this openness brings along with it belief.
Yeah, I actually think we can bypass the entire word open, because I do think it obscures the argument. And just for anybody who doesn't understand, the key word in that definition of openness is by omission. So even if by omission you prevent someone from being able to be in relationship with you, you're not open to relationship. So imagine I move into a new apartment complex, and it's not clear that we've moved in just by looking at the windows and the door. And we have a next door neighbor. Now, I haven't told the next door neighbor that we've moved in, so they have no evidence that I'm there. And now imagine that the next door neighbor knocked on the door anyways, and we walked outside, and they said, "Oh, hey, how are you?" And they came into our home, and we had lunch together. We were great friends. Despite that, in the middle, right before we had met each other, I was not open to relationship with the neighbor. Even if they had knocked on the door and I opened up and said, "Hi, oh, hey, how are y'all?" According to this definition of openness, I actually wasn't open to relationship with my neighbor because I hadn't told them I was there yet. So just as long as people understand that that's what it's meant by openness, it's fine. We can move on. We can use it. But I think a simpler way to get at what's going on is just what I said earlier. It's that God has not ensured that everyone is able to be in relationship just by trying, and just stick with that.
Can I so this is important because I do disagree with Blake on this. I think Schellenberg's use of the word resistance is better because I'm sure we can get into this later in a deeper sense. But I mean, I think one of the things I would say, the resistance is just better, because I don't think you want to say that everyone who tries to be in relationship with God actually will be in relationship with God, because I think it's plausible that there are people who could try to be in relationship with other people and still it's permissible or even fine for them to resist that. So like a really brutal example of this is that suppose there's an abusive relationship going on, and the one person, the kind of abuser, is really trying to be in a relationship with the other person, but it's just a really horrible person and doing all this other kind of stuff. That I think is plausibly resistance. And if there's that kind of moral resistance, then I think that is plausibly resistance, and that's a kind of problem for the argument. But that's why I think it's easier to talk about resistance than it is to talk about trying. I think we should get into theodicies and that kind of stuff, to be honest. But I think it's important to bring out that I disagree that it's a better version of the argument. I think resistance captures it better.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is some controversy over the definition of open or how it's being used here, whether or not that hinders the argument, makes it worse or whatever. And so maybe we can sort of sidestep that. I agree with Josh. Maybe we can move into the theodicies, the explanations for why God would allow the hiddenness in the world. And one thing that I wanted to point out of this argument is that it says that no person is ever non-resistantly in a state of non-belief. And I think that little part there sort of explains or makes it clear that on Christian theism, so at the end of so before I get into that, I'm going to go ahead and open it back up to you guys. And if you guys want to give a theodicy or an explanation. So I was about to jump into one, but I'm going to give it up to you guys. I don't want to misspeak or. So yeah, go ahead.
Josh, do you want to start with the first theodicy or me? Okay. If you go to, I run a website called beliefmap.org, and it's a website that's set up so that you can explore these questions in almost a dialogue format. I've made a dialogue tree. So you can go there to get the details on all the different categories of objections to hiddenness. But the categories, at least, there are 5 of them. Is category 1 would be, so what if a loving God existed, would God ensure that we'd know it? That's the question in the background. In order to foster a relationship, would he do this? And some reasons given for answering no would be, first, that some would just immediately reject relationship. And Schellenberg's version of the argument, thankfully, dismisses this objection. It doesn't apply. The next 4 do. The next category would be basically that some would just have an improper relationship with God, the kind that would be better not to exist in the first place. So they could be in a relationship, but it would be a bad kind. Others would just abandon.
And so real quick, what do you mean by that? It would be an improper relationship.
So it's not the theodicy I was going to jump into, but for example,
if you want, you can move on to the other one that you want to defend. I'm
well,
cool
just yeah, I can say it quickly. So, for example, this would be a relationship where the human doesn't recognize God as good. So the person could be in relationship with God, but they could disagree with God morally, and that might be fine if they were open to moral transformation. But some humans reject God's moral transformation. They can just perpetually not like what God does, or they can lack the right kind of desire for God. So they could be praising and praying to God just for gifts like a happy afterlife, or they could, we've all heard of these kinds of theists who want to be theist or pray to God just to feel like religious experiences. I know an atheist in the area who goes to church services just for something like that. Or someone who just wants to be in a relationship with God because they're afraid and they want to escape punishment. So they'll do these relationship-like things, but they're not really there for relationship's sake.
So it sounds like improper in the sense of they don't have the right sort of motivations, the right goals. And the right goal is to just sort of love God for God himself, for being perfectly good and loving and that kind of thing. They have the wrong motivations. It sounds like is that a correct characterization?
Yeah, I think when we're thinking of supposedly God, the greatest possible being, God's far more complex than just being all loving. He's also got other properties like being all just. And I think as you examine conceptually what philosophically that would mean is that God would value the good, and I think some great, very good things. And in my ultimate view, the thing that God most aims for is a world without evil and with people who have freely chosen to be with God. And I think in that sort of context, that enriches the whole discussion. It's less of a one-dimensional view of what God is. And yes, you can enter into types of relationship with this God, which ultimately aren't good for that full multidimensional character of God.
Now, Justin and Ben, do you guys want to jump in here, or are you cool with us moving on to a different theodicy?
Yeah, I'd like to. So the first objection was that finite person would reject a relationship, and the second objection was an improper relationship. So you said there was a total of 5. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to hear the other 3, just so that we get them all on the table, and then we can pick through it.
That'd be good. Okay, thanks.
Alternatively, we could we don't have to go through all of them because there are other ones that I'm quite happy to chat about, and I think that if we concentrate on particular ones, that I think that might be.
Just let me list the categories. I'm not listing all the theodicies by any means because each of these categories have several theodicies inside of them. I'm just listing the categories. So okay. The first one was that some would immediately reject relationships, some would have an improper relationship. Here's the third. Some would enter into proper relationship, but then they'd abandon the relationship later in life. And that's the one I'm going to come back to and focus on. Then there's a whole other category that argues that greater goods of relationship can obtain with divine silence. There's a bunch published on this, a bunch of theodicies. And finally, the last category is total greater goods in general obtain with divine silence. So the prior one was focusing on relationship goods in particular. The final category says greater goods overall obtained with divine silence. And the theodicy, the quickest one that you can just immediately apprehend is the third one I mentioned, is that some non-theists, if they became theists, would enter into proper relationship with God, but then abandon it later in life. And several examples have been published on this. You could, again, related to the first category, you could come to disbelieve in God's goodness. You could grow jealous of God. That's been published on by Domesday. You could have a growing hatred of God because he allows suffering, for example. You could come to love sin yourself. And all of the, no matter what the reason, this is going to be relevant, because if a relationship would be abandoned later in life, then plausibly it holds no value to God if it's going to be abandoned later in life, or it could even hold negative value. The relationship between God and man is often compared to a marriage, and God could view this breaking apart as something akin to a divorce, where it would have been very better not to get married in the first place. So that would be the first theodicy.
So let's go ahead and go through this one. So Justin or Ben, how would you respond to this?
Yeah, so so of those general categories, one of them that I'd like to address is this notion that that if provided belief, that these non-resistant individuals, it's at least possible that some of them might form an improper relationship with God. Now, I think that first of all, there's a kind of general problem with both the general theodicy here and the kind of subcategories of different ways in which this might occur. The first general problem is that the way Blake phrases it here is that in their current state, that is the way that they are, which presumes a kind of life, some prior life experience, that the way that they are, these non-resistant non-believers, if given belief in God, would only enter into the relationship for poor reasons, or in a way that makes the relationship improper in some sense. The general concern here is, first of all, that it begs the question, in that it assumes that there are non-resistant non-believers in the first place on theism. This is a problem because that is not what the argument says. It says that there are no non-resistant persons that fail to believe that God would then provide, as a reaction to learning about these persons, causally sufficient evidence for belief. All the way down on all these subcategories. This just begs the question against the argument. So that's the general complaint, because as Schellenberg writes, it does not follow from the fact, if it is a fact, that some bad state of affairs would be permitted or some good foregone if God gives evidence for belief to some inculpable non-believer in the midst of life, that such would be the case if God had prevented her from ever being an inculpable non-believer in the first place. And it is the latter state of affairs which the Hiddenness argument tells us that we will find if there is a God. If that argument is sound, then inculpable resistance, if the argument is sound, then culpable resistance, shutting God out, is the only source of non-belief in a world created by God. Now, a more kind of specific complaint for some of these subcategories is that for a non-resistant person to react in this way upon receiving belief in God, they are no longer they are no longer non-resistant, rendering the objection a red herring. In other words, if the relationship in which they enter with God upon acquiring belief is improper, many of these ways in which it does that kind of reveal a resistance in them, which is a misunderstanding of the argument. That is not, it would simply say that God is no longer, divine love does not entail that resistant non-belief would be met with causally sufficient reasons for belief. Or that these persons would have been kind of endowed with a deficient conception of God. So, for example, if one grows jealous of God's power, what that boils down to is that, jealousy, you're kind of talking about the state of affairs, where you're saying, okay, God has all this power, and it would be better if I had it, and I'm kind of jealous of that power. When a person with a proper conception of God, which is what God would reveal of himself, would be like, oh, well, clearly I can't handle this. God is the proper agent for this power. And so there is no way in which a person who properly understands God would then also be jealous of God upon acquiring the belief in God. So either the specific problem with these objections, I think, is the general problem is that it assumes that there are non-resistant non-believers in the first place. Specific problems is that it assumes on multiple numbers of these that it just translates into a kind of resistance, which is a misunderstanding of the argument, or it assumes that God has given a faulty conception of God when, in fact, a loving God would give a proper conception of God. So that's what I would say about at least the improper relationship objection.
Okay, so I heard three objections. The first one is that what I was saying, that this improper relationship theodicy, the whole set of them, it assumes that the individual has prior life experience. The second objection was that these, at least some of them, I don't know if you were saying all of them, but at least some of them reveal a resistance to God. So I'm actually suggesting that these individuals aren't open to relationship, but that they're resistant to non-believers. And thirdly, you're thinking that, well, this would be solved anyways because God would reveal a proper conception to them, which would prevent these from happening in the first place. So the first one, whether this assumes a prior life experience. I know you mentioned this in the video response that you made to my interaction with Matt Dillahunty, and I didn't understand it. I didn't put a time element anywhere in the theodicy there. These persons can always be such that they would enter into a relationship with God, but it would be an improper relationship. And it could be any one of those types of improper relationships. So there's no time element involved.
Maybe I misunderstood. When we're talking about the argument is that, look, there would be no non-resistant non-belief. This theodicy, at least as I've understood it, is a kind of theodicy to explain why God would not necessarily give belief to all persons. Whether or not relationship would be entered into is a separate matter entirely. I'm specifically focused on the question of whether or not belief would be provided to non-resistant persons. Now, you're saying that one of the reasons why God would not provide belief is because perhaps then they would enter into a relationship which is improper.
Real quick. It's not about why God would or wouldn't give belief. It's about why God would not even ensure that all believe. Because some people are freely disposed such that they just would, upon entering into any relationship at all, enter into an improper relationship.
I want to let Josh jump in real quick. He has something to say, I think.
Yeah, so this is, so Justin quoted an article by Schellenberg. I think it's the Hiddenness Arguments Revisited, part 1 or 2, one of the two. And that he's responding, it's a general scheme of arguments, and that the first person who I know of who kind of brought it up as guide is Daniel Howard Snyder, who's a really brilliant philosopher. I think there's a subtle question, and I think Blake is bringing it out, but the question is that what is meant irrelevance? And so he's basically saying that this kind of argument is irrelevant as a counter response. I think it's not, because so Travis Dumsday, when he published the responses, he says no, it's not, because Schellenberg is willing to grant that people don't come to belief immediately. He says that there's they may not be able to come to belief immediately, and then a kind of state of I can't remember, it's a time of proper thing that God will reveal himself to them, and then at that moment, as soon as they're ready, that he's going to reveal himself to them. There could be reasons before that whether that's kind of in their life experience before that.
You're talking about the advent of the cognitive capacities which are necessary for belief, right? Okay.
Yeah, or at least their nature and that kind of thing. So either their nature is formed in some way that they develop different.
I'm not sure what you mean. Could you talk about what you mean by nature? Because as I understand Schellenberg, what he's arguing is that at the onset of the necessary faculties, assuming non-resistance, the person would have belief.
It looks like we're having some technical difficulty. Hey, Josh. Josh, if you can just turn your video off real quick. It looks like you're having some streaming. and let's see if we can just get your voice there. And let's so let's try it again.
Yeah, there we are. Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah, so in terms of nature is before the kind of, so I can't remember what Schellenberg calls it, but he says there's a kind of point at which God's going to reveal themselves, the age of revelation. I think that's what it's called. Before then, God could, the person could just be develop, means they're ill-disposed to relationship with God. Suppose that they are in an abusive relationship with their parent before that, for example. Suppose that concept of may not mean they're not specifically resistant to relationship with God, but it might mean they're like, but certainly ill-disposed to the relationship. Suppose that they are really immature at this stage, that kind of thing. There are just lots of reasons that could develop either before that in their life experience, or that could just already be there in their nature. That's that's I think why I disagree with kind of Schellenberg's response here. Does that make sense?
I've not read that at all in Schellenberg, and I've read pretty much everything he's put out on this. I've not heard anything about an age of revelation. Does that are you maybe interpreting criticism and applying it to him, maybe accidentally?
I'm pretty sure. I will search it up and I will try and find this. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But like I'm about 80% sure that I've heard.
Okay, because I'm 81% sure that you're wrong about that.
Fair enough. That's cool.
Guys, if we can back up just a second, I'm just a little bit confused as to exactly where we are in this discussion. If we can just sort of take a step back, and which of those 5 categories, Blake, are we discussing at this point? Is it the second category, the improper relationship, or are we talking about a different category? If we can just sort of clear that up, and that's really just for me, so that I can be clear on what's being discussed.
Right. So there were 5 categories, and I listed them quickly. And you had asked about the improper relationship one just because you were curious. So I mentioned a little bit about it. I wanted to focus on the abandoned relationship later in life one, but because I talked a little bit about it, that was Justin's first target. And so now we're focusing on the second one rather than the third one, which is fine. It's important to talk about.
Yeah, and if you guys wouldn't mind, can we move on to that third theodicy, or the third category that he was?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up there. Go ahead. Sorry.
Before we do, remember Justin raised 3 objections, and I only got to respond to one of them, so it's fine if we move on. But just know that those were left hanging, which is fine. You know, we have to pick where we're going to go.
Yeah, I mean, if that part of if that category isn't something that you're like super excited about going into, anyways, then we might as well just go ahead and move on to the one that you're.
Oh, I'm excited about going into it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so if you're interested more, however you want to phrase it or call it, but.
Let me go ahead and throw out my my objections to the 3 points that Justin made. Then he can, give a response. Then we'll close it out. He can have the last word on it. Then maybe we can let Josh raise a theodicy of his own, and I can close out with the one I was going to start with.
Okay, because we're already getting up on the 1 hour point. So so just quickly from you, Blake, and then quickly from you, Justin, and then we'll move back to Josh.
Yeah. The second objection to the improper relationship theodicy that Justin brought up was that these reveal, according to him, a kind of resistance to the individual. And well, the argument was all about non-resistant non-believers. And so I'm sort of cheating. And I don't think I am. I don't recall Schellenberg ever saying that resistance involves a rejection of moral transformation. If he includes all of these individuals, these types of individuals, into resistant non-believers, well, then I'm going to object to the premise that says that resistant non-believer, or that there are non-resistant non-believers. All of a sudden, that now it's very easy to say, well, how do we know if there are any non-resistant non-believers? For all we know, everyone who's an atheist falls into this category. And that's suddenly become far easier. Whereas before, I wouldn't have said that, because I think it's clear that there are non-resistant non-believers, but I don't think it's clear that there are non-believers who are not in this category. Okay, So that's my quick response there. Finally, he raised this objection that God, in revealing himself to these individuals, would reveal a proper conception that would prevent them from, for instance, he picked the jealousy example, from growing jealous of God or disagreeing with God morally. And I don't think that follows, even if, I mean, so we'll be objective about morality. We can say that God, let's say the person recognizes that God is the good, and that God's commands, that's what moral ought supervenes on. When God, what is it for something to be right? Well, it's something that's commanded by God. Even like in the strong sense, a person could even know that, and they could still dislike it. They could hear God say, "Don't lie, don't do this," and the person could still be such that they reject it and they don't steal and they just don't like it, even if they know that God is objectively right. And if someone's in that kind of situation and they're preventing God from transforming them and making them different, that's a kind of improper relationship that I don't think God would tolerate in heaven or whatever God's ultimate plan for humanity is. And go ahead, Justin. You can finish it off. I won't respond.
Before you go, Justin, I just wanted to draw attention to when we established the premise that there were non-resistant non-believers, we gave specific examples. And so one of those specific examples would be former believers. So recall, former believers were already on the right religious path. They were in a relationship with God, and a loss of belief has terminated that relationship. So these are examples of non-resistant non-believers. To say that they would just form an improper relationship doesn't seem to really fit with that example, because they were already in the relationship. They already had the proper relationship, and then their doubts, their reasonable doubts moving along, are what have caused the non-belief. It's because God was closed to them. Another example would be lifelong seekers. These are people that are seeking a relationship and trying to be found by a divine parent. And so I don't think it's at all, I don't think you could say that, these people would then form an improper relationship. These are the prime people for developing a conscious, meaningful relationship, and it would be the greatest good for those people. God is omnipotent, so he has the resources to accommodate the possible consequences of openness to relationship with finite persons, making them compatible with the flourishing of all concerned and of any relationship that may come to exist between them. So God creates the rules. He's perfectly loving. He can set everything up so that there's relationship compatible goods.
Let me actually kind of run off that point. Blake, with regard to my objection about the proper conception of God, I had raised that in response to jealous of God's power, and you know what, I'm going to actually take that back. I think you're right in that that objection wouldn't make sense to that. What I meant to say was in regard to one of your subcategories, which is considers a way in which God might have, or a way in which a person might have an improper relationship with God. One of the subcategories is that he would consider himself an authority over a God. And that is what I meant to bring that objection toward. That is quite clearly a faulty conception of God. I agree that that response wouldn't work with the other one. But as a more general problem with this argument, or with this particular theodicy about the improper relationship, is that, as what's important here is that there is the resources available to God here. So, for example, perhaps a person, upon receiving belief, as Giunta has argued, that they would enter it in a kind of an improper way, or the kind of belief that they would enter would be improper for whatever reason. But this is, of course, just going to be the first step in a relationship, a complex reciprocal relationship unfolding over time. So once one enters into a relationship, even if they're doing so for the wrong reasons, the genesis of that divine relationship, whether it be met with a positive embrace or a confused kind of immature anger, is just that. It's the genesis. From there, a perfectly loving God will, as a loving and wise parent would, this is what we expect of all loving and wise parents, would lovingly shepherd them in a kind of freedom-preserving way, or recognition of their own moral failures and a recognition of the divine mercy in a kind of an understanding of the true nature of God, a deeper understanding, a reciprocal relationship that gets deeper and deeper into the knowledge of God.
And it's the greatest possible good. It's the greatest
yeah, this
possible
is the transformation, the moral transformation. Not all relationships start off properly. The point is that that's not an excuse to end it. The point is that God, with the resources he has available to them, would shepherd the relationship from that immaturity into a deeper divine human relationship, ending that immaturity. And of course, you know, a relationship is a dynamic thing. Nothing about the hiddenness argument suggests that a relationship would be all roses and candy. There's going to be tensions. There's going to be all these different things. None of those tensions give us any reason to suggest that God would close himself off, just as any kind of tension between a parent and a child would not excuse the parent from abandoning the child. And so that's, I think, a really important thing, is that the improperness of a relationship, however improper you think it might be, that is not a reason at all to suggest that God would make himself unavailable to such a relationship.
All right, so yeah, let's open it back up to Josh. If you wanted to raise a different theodicy, or if you wanted to respond to what Justin was saying.
I'll do a bit of both. Can you hear me? Am I good?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. I'm going to assume I'm good and roll. I was like, I had a choice. I was trying to work out which area I go to. I think I'll go with. So one of the most that it was mentioned earlier that this argument has a history. That so non-Christians who have there are Christians who have discussed this argument. The most prominent is a guy.
Hey Josh, we're getting some
we're
getting some interference there. You're kind of jumping in and out with your audio. Am I the only one that's hearing that, or are you guys hearing that as well? Okay.
Yeah,
so
I'm getting the same problem.
Okay. Try it again one more time.
For this to me. Okay, are we better? That's gone weird.
Yeah, just try again, I guess.
This. Yeah. Okay. Better.
You're good. Go ahead.
Great. Yeah. Basically, Joseph Butler discusses this. He's got a book called The Analogy of Religion. In Divine Hiddenness and Human Reason, which is Schellenberg's first work, he discusses Joseph Butler. So this is like he's discussed Joseph Butler early. He discusses Swin, like one of the ones that he discusses the most. And so there's been a lot of theories that God would allow Divine Hiddenness to allow for the possibility of cooperative investigation, believers or not between non-believers into the existence, the question of the existence of God. I think this is plausible for a lot of reasons. One, it's a kind of intrinsically valuable task. I think that God would, so Schellenberg, I think from what I've read, tends to value the way in which we might come to know God would be some sort of non-sensory kind of religious experience. I don't know that for everyone. I think that God could be creative and diverse in the way in which he gets people to know him. And if God creates a variety of persons, it may well be that a kind of long inquiry for people to come into relationship with him. And that might require a state of non-belief at that time. If God wants people to come to know him through an intellectual inquiry, that may well be the best way for them to get to know him. If God is the root of all truth, that's plausible as well. If God wants us to engage in some sort of cooperative endeavor, that might be. I think that if I'm granted this, then there's a further step that you get, which is that John DePoe has got a paper called On the Epistemological Framework for Skeptical Theism. It is arguing that skeptical theism is the idea that there are certain things that we don't know, and that we should know that. Sorry, in the problem of evil literature, that the fact that we can't see the reason for certain evils isn't a reason to not think there aren't those kinds of reasons. It can be applied to the argument from divine hiddenness as well. What he's arguing is that this would be one of those kind of justifications, that if God wanted to allow inquiry into God's nature, then he may well leave a bit of epistemic distance, and that then might mean there are more reasons to allow hiddenness that we don't know about. Now, I foresee an objection, and the objection is something called accommodationism, and it's to what's been talked about already, that God is so infinitely resourceful, and God has this divine bias towards relationships, that God would always, people would be in relationships, and he would try to get them kind of best possible, the next best alternative. What Schellenberg talks about is his idea is that instead of that what's more valuable than just coming to believe in God is actually finding out all about all the facets of God and engaging in cooperative investigation together into all the amazing ways in which God has a providence in the world and all this kind of stuff. So that's his idea, and so that's way more valuable than just coming to know the fact that God exists. So why does God allow this epistemic distance, and why does he allow hiddenness at all? I want to say two things. One, I think it's just quite a valuable way of investigation. Like, why can't, so just as I could, there are like lots of friends I might be able to have in the world, but I choose like my particular friends, and like that's a particular relationship that's valuable. And so if these are particular that are valuable, I just don't see that God has to not allow that to happen, for one. The second thing, I think there's a reverse move to play on accommodationism, that if God is infinitely resourceful, then not only is it, then it's, suppose you want to play it, you can play it one way, which is that surely God would allow relationship, and God would do everything possible to ensure relationship. I think you can play it the other way around, and that you could play, suppose God's infinitely resourceful, couldn't he bring a greater good out of hiddenness in the second place? If he's so amazing, he's so loving, he's so good, he's so wonderful, can he do it the other way around? And I think that that is plausible as well, and I think that's more plausible, to be honest. So that would be my response to accommodationism, which I know is Schellenberg's biggest response in the literature and has been mentioned already. So whoever wants to jump in.
So I know Justin has a response that he'd like to sink his teeth into, and before he gets to that, I would again want to bring us back to those examples of non-resistant non-believers that we gave in the opening, to show that there are non-resistant that this sort of move just wouldn't apply to. So for example, isolated non-theists, I gave the example of Amazonian tribesmen. They've never been in a position to resist belief or even go through this great good of discovering God, because they've never even had the idea of God. They unavoidably live their entire lives with the influence of a fundamentally misleading system of religious meaning and value. So, you know, we could speculate that Amazonian tribesmen are animists or something like that, but they certainly don't have this concept of a monotheistic being. And so they just can't respond in these sort of good ways. And I just wanted to, again, draw attention to that this sort of move just doesn't even apply to this category of non-resistant non-believer.
I wanted to add one thing here, if I could just jump in for a second as well. I read a paper recently by Doherty and Poston, however you pronounce it. They argued that for people like this, there is a distinction that they make in the paper, the de dicto versus de re belief. And so you can have a belief, or you don't necessarily have to have a belief in this exact person in order to have a meaningful relationship with them. And so you can, I can't think of the exact example, but so basically you don't need to know the name of this person, even if it's the incorrect name of this person. You can still have a meaningful relationship with this person, even though that you may not know everything there is to know about them. And so the idea basically is that most people have a sort of spiritual sense of the divine or some sort of spiritual awareness. And so even though that they may not identify that experience that they have with God, with the classical concept of God, that doesn't mean that they can't be in a meaningful relationship with that person, even though they might not identify that experience that they have with God. And then the other idea is that in the end of the world, there's going to be this at the eschaton when Jesus comes back and everything, and this is obviously on Christian theism, but the idea is that everyone is going to eventually come to this belief that God exists, and so everyone is going to have that belief at one point on Christian theism. But the idea there would be that with these people in the Amazonian tribes or whatever, the information that they had available to them would still count toward the relationship that they would have later on. And so the basic idea is that you don't have to know everything there is to know about this person. So the experience that they have could still benefit them and create a meaningful relationship later on once they are given the full information, which on Christian theism they will obtain at some point. So that's just one point that I wanted to make there.
Blake hasn't talked in a while. I have objections to raise, but perhaps Blake wants to say a few things. Real
quick, is there any other points that you want to make on what Josh said?
Me personally?
Yeah, either one of you.
Yeah, I think Justin's got some points.
Yeah. So one of the objections he raised, and then he anticipated objections to that objection, is that non-belief is necessary for investigating the fact of whether or not God exists. Okay, and I think that it's important to not only mention the fact that isolated non-theists are important to bring up here, but it's important to also note that this isolation can occur geographically and temporally. So, throughout human history, the vast majority of people just didn't have a concept of, the monotheistic God that has come about through Abrahamic religions, right? And it's true that a lot of people, it's true that evolutionary forces, or in whatever way you want to attribute this, that we have a particular susceptibility, and by that I don't mean a negative connotation here. We just have a particular susceptibility to belief in immaterial persons, but with regard to cognitive science. But that is the limit of what that brings us with regard to specificity. Cognitive science does not tell us that. This is the reason why cultures are so varied in their concepts of immaterial persons. So few have independently come to a robust monotheism. Now, to get to the point of Josh's argument, which was an objection based on the goodness of investigating the fact of God. Now, he says that the accommodationist reply here, which I'm going to present, is a kind of, God will go, even if he can't get the top good, he'll go with, the second good, the second best good. But I don't think that's accurate. What Schellenberg is saying here is that investigations of the type that are aimed at investigating the fact of whether or not God exists, that these are just mere tokens of the general goodness of investigation. And another thing exists within that category, which is that the goodness of learning about God himself, a kind of what's a good word? A kind of a deeper experiential knowledge. Now, whereas Josh had argued that that the kind of learning about God rather than learning that God, that this is a kind of secondary good. I don't think that that's true. I think that these are just both goods that exist within a general category of the goodness of investigation. I think that if either one of them is to be considered superior than the other, I think it's quite obvious that the experiential and propositional knowledge about God is far superior than the mere propositional fact of whether or not God exists. One of those investigations is far deeper and far more enriching, and if we are created to know God, and to have a relationship with God, it's just quite clear that that is the best for our well-being. And of course, again, I do not mean to emphasize a kind of hedonistic view of well-being. I'm talking about the orienting ourselves to the deepest goods. And so again, I think that the accommodations...
Relationship compatible goods.
Yes, relationship compatible goods. And I think that it's quite obvious that learning about God is superior than learning that God, even though learning that God is a necessary condition to learning about God in the way that I'm talking about, in the kind of deep relational experiential knowledge that might be acquired through such a relationship.
Yeah. On that, I'm like probably quite happy to grant. Like, okay, like, I'll grant for the sake of argument even that oh God, I don't know that relationship. No, okay. Don't grant then that it's just another token. I think it's just as different friendships are not tokens of the things friendships, but are particularly good in themselves. That I don't believe they're token goods. I believe they're individual goods. That the same way I would say that individual forms of investigation aren't tokens of some broader good, but this is a good in itself and intrinsically. And so there need to be cashing out of what it means to be a token, what means to be a good. I'd also say that I don't think that I think there's an equivocation in accommodationism Schellenberg presents it in what I've read, in that I don't think it needs to be that the kind of Swinburne defender or the Butler defender is saying that we either get into the fact that God exists or we get investigation into all this other stuff. I think an even better might be that to get into the fact that God exists, and then they discover that God exists, and then they get to do all this other investigation as well, and so you get even more good. And so if you get that's even better. And so that's like one response to it. And
before we go further, Josh, I wanted to give Blake an opportunity to jump back in if he wanted to. We haven't heard from him in a while.
There's a lot of different directions. I'm trying to think of what the most important ones are. In the conversation that I was in a while ago, Ben and Justin both had said something that's worth responding to, but something that has come up a couple of times that I think deserves a response that didn't get a chance to be responded to is something that Ben brought up. He keeps saying, well, in our opening statement, sort of, the opening remarks, the stuff you're saying doesn't apply to these people over here. And I think this misunderstands the structure of what this discussion's doing. It wasn't meant to, and it doesn't have to cover everyone, right? I mean, the Hiddenness argument makes the bold claim. It says that there are no non-resistant non-theists at all. So if I show that there could be a non-resistant non-believer XYZ over there, and then Ben comes back and says, well, whatever, that doesn't apply to these other non-resistant non-believers. I mean, that's just missing, what we're doing. My response is fine. My theodicy doesn't have to apply to them, but insofar as you do that, you've missed what the original argument was doing in the first place, which said there would be no non-resistant non-believers if God existed. And for what it's worth, I do think that there are other theodicies that apply to these persons that Ben is bringing up. So I thought that was the most important thing that I'd want to interject.
Right, and so I just want to confirm that. So premise 2 of the Blake, it looks like I'm getting a little bit of feedback on your end.
Oh, let me mute myself.
Oh, really, I just wanted to say that, if we look back at premise 2 of the argument that was originally presented, it says, if there exists a God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person, then no finite person is ever non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. So it does seem that Blake is right here, that pointing to these other groups of people seems to sort of be an irrelevant move at that point. We still need to show that, there is no finite person ever. It doesn't matter if there's these other people that are, in the state, whatever, in the Amazon or whatever. It's got to be, it's got to apply to everybody. So
yeah, I don't think that we were not bringing attention to the existence of such persons as a way to completely make that objection irrelevant. We were just saying that clearly it doesn't apply to some people. There are some people that it doesn't apply to. And so to that degree, it's at least somewhat relevant. It doesn't completely empty the objection that Blake is making of all force. It's just...
Because the argument could always then be reformulated to say, okay, well, there wouldn't be any of these kinds of non-resistant non-believers. It would just be a swapping out of it. And then we've also given other objections, such as God has the resources to accommodate the possible consequences of his being open to relationship with finite persons. And so that all these types of goods that you're talking about, that, you know, oh, these might be of intrinsic good over here, those can all be realized in a relationship with God. And so, again, I can't stress this point enough. It's the greatest possible value that could be for someone, which would be to enter into this meaningful relationship with God freely, because free will is a great good on a lot of theistic conceptions. And so that when we talk about things like the problem of evil, the risks of being able to have that free choice to enter into a relationship is worth taking, because free will is such a great good. And so I think that point should be emphasized a bit, because again, I really want to stress the openness that is self-evidently part of perfect love. We're talking about an unsurpassably loving being who would just be, who to use Schellenberg's analogy again, would be like the light bulb that's always shine. His radiance is always shining. And the only way to get away from that is if you close your eyes, if you resist it on your own. And so I don't think it at all to say that light bulb would go completely off because of some auxiliary good that might be out there. I just don't give a whole lot of weight to that.
Okay, so just to back up, remember the argument that was presented today that we're going after is this argument that says there would be no non-resistant non-believers whatsoever. Our job, all we have to do to overturn the argument is show some examples of people that plausibly could be non-resistant non-believers who God doesn't reveal himself to. So if you try to say, well, yeah, but that doesn't apply to these other people over here, that's fine. The argument's still overturned. Now, you say the argument can be reformulated, and that's fine. I actually think it should. I'd prefer there to be multiple different hiddenness arguments so that we could tackle each of these individual types with the relevant theodicy. But that's not what's happening today. Yes, the argument can be reformulated, but that's not what's happening.
You have to take that point into consideration, because we're overturning your objection by saying it doesn't apply to everything and it doesn't work. So those are two reasons.
Hold on. I never said it applied to everything.
No, that's what I'm saying. So we're trying to undercut your objection. So we're making this point. It doesn't. It obviously clearly doesn't apply to formal believers or isolated non-theists, and they're not relationship compatible goods.
I'll get to that. But the structure of the argument is such that in order to overturn Schellenberg's argument, which was what was on the paper that we all exchanged, the argument that's being presented, all I have to do is show that there's even one non-resistant non-believer, or plausibly that there's one non-resistant non-believer.
We've already granted that. So we say there are non-resistant non-believers. We're saying that those would not obtain.
Compatible with God's existence, right? Yeah. That God can exist
with God's openness, with perfect love, with God's perfect openness to relationship. Those wouldn't obtain, and so we can see that that's the case when you say, well, here's a reason why he might be closed to a relationship. So we can say that reason doesn't apply across the board. We know that. It wasn't meant to. Okay, well, fine then. You grant that it wasn't meant to. Fine, but then the reason doesn't work. So then we say, like, the reason is either irrelevant, or it's not relationship compatible, or it's just not characteristic of a perfectly loving being. It makes the perfectly loving being more like a delinquent parent who just says, well, you know, there's these other goods that they might be able to achieve. I know they could achieve a lot greater goods with me, but I'm going to close myself off to them. And I just don't find a whole lot of force in those.
So I think that mostly this is a red herring. I think that it's important to mention those things, but I think that for the most part, it's fair to just talk about whether or not this deductive argument, which is making bold claims, is a good argument. I think that mentioning those kinds of unbelievers is relevant, but it's not. It doesn't really do much to the conversation. It's just important to keep that in the background. Yeah.
It's not decided. It's given for context.
Yeah. So going back and forth on this, I don't think is terribly productive. So it might just be good to jump into another theodicy, perhaps.
Let me respond to the other point that Ben has brought up, and that's been brought up a couple times as well. That, hey, God's resourceful, right? God could prevent people from being like this, from being disposed to be in an improper relationship because God's so great and good. And there's two things to point out. One is what Josh already did. This is kind of like a cheat card, and it can be used different ways. You can say, well, if God's so resourceful, then God could bring about sufficient good of any hiddenness. So no matter how good you say the relationship is, you can still say, well, God's so resourceful, he can bring out better relationships and all forth, even though you can't think of how, that it's possible. You can both sides can play that card, but insofar as you at least are trying to think for yourself to come up with specifics, I would say no. Actually, it doesn't seem to me that God's infinite resourcefulness would solve this problem. It seems to me that some people are freely such that if they entered into any relationship or became aware of God's existence, they would just enter into an improper relationship, and there's nothing to do at that point aside from violate their freedom.
So guys, we're coming up to the point where we're almost at 12:30 Central Time. And so I wanted to check with you guys. We had allotted 1.5 hours for this discussion. If you guys want, we can go a little bit longer because, it happens so very, very frequently. Yeah, go ahead, Blake.
I was going to say, before we finish up, is it okay if I quickly present the very short theodicy that I was hoping to get to?
Well, I wanted to open it up to Justin and Ben and see and even Josh, if you guys are available. If you want to go a little bit longer, maybe to 12:45.
I'm fine with that personally.
I'm fine as well.
Okay, so yeah, if we have a little bit more time, then yeah, let's just go a little bit further into it. So, and if you guys are cool, then I would like to get to Blake's new theodicy. Okay.
Okay, so just jump into it.
Yeah,
so,
go right ahead.
Remember that there are 5 categories of theodicies that I think apply to the hiddenness argument. We've tapped into about, less than 10% of the responses and things that need to be dealt with just in terms of the theodicies. One of them, though, is actually a whole category of itself. I couldn't, nest it in any of the other categories. And it's just that some non-theists, if they became theists, would enter into even a proper relationship with God, but then they would abandon it later in life for one reason or another. And then I mentioned that this is relevant because if it was abandoned later in life, then plausibly this could be like a divorce. It could be such that it would have been better for the relationship never to have started in the first place. I haven't seen this talked about much in publications, but I'd be interested in what y'all think about it.
Blake, I actually couldn't find this in the literature. Is this a unique objection to you then, or?
Yeah, I don't recall anyone reading it because I'm scrolling through this and I don't have any citations by it. So okay. Yeah, I think this might actually. Well, no, this would the Growing Jealous of God that Domesday published would probably. Yes. That would be an aspect of it, but it doesn't have to be. So yeah, no one specifically mentioned it before, so it might be unique to me.
I think.
Sure.
Well, I think the point you're making about it, Blake, is that it's not. The reason that this is significant is because of the ultimate good of God or the ultimate good of the person who leaves the relationship, from what I understand. It's like it because it's like a divorce, and that sometimes we might want to say that it's better to have loved and lost than never loved at all, but it's like a really bad breakup, we might want to say the reverse. And so I think that's what you're wanting to say.
Exactly. And especially if you want to get to Christians ultimately and using this objection to them, because there's like biblical reasons to think that this is actually what's going on for some people.
Okay. So the general idea here is that, a kind of metaphysical divorce between God and man is such a deep problem, or such a disvalue that you know, that's at least some people might do this, that therefore for these people, you know, that entering into a relationship is of value, but it would be a comparative less value to the ultimate demise of that relationship. So I would suggest is that when we kind of fill this out, I mean, it's easy enough to have these two propositions, right? Person enters belief, it's possible that they might divorce later on, right? I would suggest that once you fill that out, it severely undermines the resourcefulness of God's ability to maintain a relationship with an individual. And it also entails that for whatever, I don't know, essentially what I'm saying is that once in a relationship, God and this person are going to go deeper into a relationship. There may be periods of tension. There may be other periods of whatever. But to get to the point where that person leaves relationship altogether, there has to be some event or accumulation of events that just do not make sense on this view. And so what I'm saying is,
you're saying that basically God wouldn't allow that to happen, or he wouldn't permit any state of affairs where someone enters into a relationship and then eventually falls out of relationship. You're saying that the argument sort of entails that state of affairs never happens.
What I'm saying is that there would have to be a point at which the person just resists, just like without any causal antecedents, just magically becomes a resistant person in the midst of that relationship. And if that's the case, then the argument no longer applies to them. No one should be surprised that a person who resists would then fail to believe. God is under no real obligation to reveal himself to resistant persons. So I have a few points here on this specific objection. You know, if it's the case that the person does leave, then, you know, we're going to have freedom of choice. If that's not relevant, then there's a problem for other values of free will.
Free choice is a great good in and of itself. Bringing on the risks of free will is worth it. Because free will and choosing a relationship is such a great good.
So for example, you know, the notion that a relationship might be spoiled by way of an exercise of free will, that shouldn't count against the relationship itself, because in the same way that the failure of in the same way that an abuse of free will doesn't count against the problem of evil, it shouldn't count against the relationship in which a abuse of free will might occur. But again, I would stress the point that it doesn't even make sense. There would have to be a random resistant attitude that just pops up in the context of this relationship. It doesn't even appear to be a coherent story, is what I'm saying.
So yeah,
perhaps I could get like details filled out here.
Yeah, go ahead, Blake.
So you're saying this undermines God's resourcefulness to maintain a relationship, and so a person would just have to like magically resist. But doesn't that contradict what Ben was saying earlier, that in fact we do have people who were in relationship and left? So unless you want to say no one on earth is in a relationship right now, maybe you want to talk about like some relationship in heaven, which I don't think even Schellenberg wants to do. Like, we're in relationship with God right now, at least some people are, and some of those very people Ben wants to argue or suggest have left. And the reason they do it is this answer to your question. People can leave because maybe they learned something new about God that they disagree with, or something along those lines.
So isn't
be
that
resistant.
empirical disconfirmation of the whole theodicy in the first
That would
place?
be a resistant non-believer then. I'm saying that there's former believers that are non-resistantly coming to their non-belief.
Someone in relationship with God who would be in relationship, exits relationship later, they divorce by becoming resistant.
Sure, but according to your theodicy, God would have never provided them belief in the first place if he knew ahead of time.
That's exactly my point. I'm saying there could be people who are such that if God entered into a relationship, God knows they would become resistant later, even if they're not resistant now.
Right, but then why did he provide them
What that means is there can be resistant, non-resistant non-believers now who God does not ensure that they come to belief, because he knows what it's going to result in.
Yeah, he's not saying that he would provide them belief right now. He's saying that because he knows what would happen later on, he's not going to provide it right now. And so that opens the door, so to speak, for this person to be in a state of non-belief, at least for the time being, until maybe later on they enter into a relationship or whatever. But he's just saying that right now is not the right time for this person. God knows that if they were to enter into a relationship right now, then later on they would divorce. At least that seems like what Blake is saying. So like I said, it opens the door for at least a short amount of time for there to be non-resistant non-belief.
And there could also be people who would enter, whether it's for a time, or people who would permanently enter into a state of resistance once they've learned a little bit more about God, because they just don't like it.
Oh shoot, where am I? So I guess I'm still quite confused on this. So I think that at the end of the day, we need more of a, I would like at least some kind of narrative. Give me some kind of a story wherein this occurs. Give me some kind of, rather than just fitting out two propositions that seem to be coherent, could you fill out that story for me, Blake, about how such a thing might occur? So this is again, we're talking about a God who knows ahead of time that an individual, upon entering a relationship with them and experiencing the divine goods that are on offer, experiencing the deep relational good that is supremely enjoyable to them as their it is an intrinsic value to that individual for their well-being.
So Justin, it seems like he's just asking, instead of like talking about these abstract terms, maybe if we could put it in like, a real concrete example.
Well, so what I'm saying is that I think that if you lay out two propositions, there's a way in which laying out these two propositions can be, I'm not saying that this is true of Blake, but they can seem deceptively coherent when, if filled out with detail, if flesh is put upon those bones, that it reveals some contradiction in there. And I'm arguing that I'm not yet convinced that this is a coherent state of affairs.
So here, I'll paint a picture for you. There's many, but so one example of a moral dilemma is the trolley example. So for people who aren't familiar with it, this is a dilemma of intuitions between existing humans and whether you're what's called a consequentialist or a deontologist. And so you can imagine a trolley barreling down about to kill a group of workers, like 4 workers. And you have the opportunity to press a button to change the track so that the trolley goes in a different direction, but it would end up killing someone. Now, the question is, would you do that? Then the next step of the situation says, okay, so forget the button. Let's say you're standing on an overpass. The trolley's barreling down about to kill 4 people. You have the opportunity to push one man over so that he dies, but then you save the 4. And people disagree on these things about what is good to do. And some people are rather flabbergasted at the answer of the other person. And there's a lot more examples of moral dilemmas. So God could have an opinion of this, and he could articulate his opinion, and someone could disagree with God and say, I don't like that. And even if they found out later that God was the source of moral goodness and so forth, it doesn't necessarily change how they feel about God, especially if God, for instance, would sacrifice someone or would sacrifice the 4 for the 1. They could just dislike the concept of God at that point. There's lots of things in the Old Testament that, if are true, or in the New Testament as well, the Bible, I meant to say. So if God really is against homosexuality, a homosexual person, when they find that out, or someone who is sympathetic to that and thinks it's morally permissible, could be like, man, I'm never going to worship a God who's like that, who has that opinion, who would rule over that kind of thing.
They would be resistant to belief in God.
Sorry?
They would be resistant to belief in God.
No, they could believe in God. They could be in relationship with God. But then, assuming God allows this to occur, he knows it's coming. Then when they find this information out about God and God's value system and God's views, they would be like, I'm not worshiping that God. Not for me.
Resist. They would resist belief in God at that point.
In the future. But at the moment that they come to belief, they are non-resistant. They become resistant And what this gets you, the conclusion is, you do have, right, a period where the person is a non-resistant non-believer. Now, the issue is if there are individuals like that walking out right now who God knows that if I brought that person into a relationship, there's going to be something down the line that's going to cause him to exit relationship with me. That person is right now a non-resistant non-believer who God very plausibly would not start the relationship at all.
So here's what I would say about this. So, okay, we have a scenario in which an individual ceases resisting and as a result enters belief in God. And then, they enter a relationship with God. Now, say they have, they come into the story with their particular set of moral beliefs. And let's say, for example, that, as the example you brought about, homosexuality, right? Turns out homosexuality is wrong. This person believed otherwise for a while. And, for whatever reason, now that he's in a relationship with God, God has revealed to this individual that actually, in fact, homosexuality is wrong. And, one should refrain from participating in one. Now, here's the thing. So the person came into that relationship with a particular set of moral propositions, okay? And presumably, in a relationship, when there's give and take, God would not only just reveal to them this basic fact that goes so far against their intuitions, God would do so in a shepherding and moral way, such that he makes the moral connections for the individual, reveals to them why homosexuality is wrong. Perhaps I'm wrong and homosexuality is some deep, grave moral error, right? But for that to be true, there needs to be connections that I'm not making and that individual is not making, and these connections are such that if I were in a relationship with God, God would reveal these to me as a way of deepening understanding. Again, we're going back to investigation, right? When we learn about God and we learn about the good that God is so intrinsically attached to, that rather than
so it sounds like you're saying that God could introduce certain things into that.
Yeah, he would make it make sense, right? Like if
so that the person wouldn't leave relationships, so he could give them some insight, right? And that wouldn't necessarily violate their free will.
Absolutely, there's a freedom-preserving way in which the person would come to understand, insofar as they're non-resistant. That's important. As long as they're non-resistant, there's a way in which these moral truths can have their dots slowly start to be connected. He might be, and again, he might initially be like, ugh, I don't like that at all, right? But nothing about relationships entails that it's all going to be happy flowers, right? There's going to be tensions, there's going to be difficulties, but all of this can happen within relationship. And those moral connecting of the dots can also happen within relationships.
So here's my question.
And non-belief would be the result of resistance. So they would still believe that God exists, and the only time in which they would become a non-believer is because of this built-up resistance, this dislike, this attitude towards...
Right. If God ignored that for a long time, perhaps they might become too resistant. But God would only ever really pull away from relationship to make some kind of moral point, right? Like sometimes parents will bring some epistemic distance between them and their child to make a kind of point, to make a moral point within the context of relationship. And that's perfectly compatible for God to do as well. But the point is that he would recognize that people are having difficulty with this new moral fact that they did not believe in the first place. And so God's going to help foster the moral investigation to try and connect the dots. So it turns out at the end of the day that, hey, maybe they're okay with the fact that homosexuality is wrong. Maybe they understand it at a deeper level, something that they believed was permissible before. Now, it quite obviously seems that it is wrong.
So we haven't heard from Josh in a while. I wanted to see if he wanted to jump in and add any thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, so yeah, I don't know. I mean, one of the fun things is that I know that Justin and Ben are probably compatibilists about not about libertarian free will, about free will. I am as well. Like it's kind of hilarious that we're like, oh yeah, there's all this free will stuff. Like I just don't believe there is free will. So that's the thing I'd say here, is that like there probably isn't free will. So like and actually,
well, I wouldn't agree that moral value is found in the nature of God or his commands. So
I also don't think that there's any moral value antecedently found in the brute fact of free will, even if there is free will.
Right. So there are all these things with like free will, and so I think that's hilarious for one. And more than that, J.L. Schellenberg has published at length critiques of the idea that free will is a good thing, and actually argues that if free will exists, then free will is an argument against God. So he has a chapter of the wisdom for doubt. He has separate papers on this. Justin's like talked about this. There are so many things about free will that we could talk about free will for hours. But yeah, I don't think it's very helpful, and like I think that's fun, and like Blake and Cameron are welcome to come back on that. But that's one thing to say. I think I want to go a kind of slightly different direction. So in terms of resistance, so normally when resistance comes up, Justin and Ben will hear stuff. And what will happen is someone will quote Romans 1 at you and be like, oh, but you're suppressing the truth and unrighteousness, and that's really terrible. And like, that's all this is coming from. So what you try to do, which is absolutely right and fair, is establish a plausible case of non-resistance, even, whether that's kind of through evolutionary history, whether that's through isolated non-theists. Basic thing is that resistance is just complicated. And that I was at lectures or grad classes with Brian Leftout last year. So he did a lecture series on the divine hiddenness argument, and he just pointed out that, and I think he's right, that it's just very complicated what resistance is, and I think there are ways in which it's even plausible that an isolated non-theist could be resistant. So let me just say a couple of these, because I do reject the idea that there are any non-resistant non-believers, and that's not to say I'm a better person than any non-believers. Believe me, I'm a terrible human being. But I just like, there are ways in which you could be
I think it's pretty great.
Yeah, I'm terrible. So yeah, the point is, so a couple of ways that this could happen. One is like moral resistance, and so like it's supposed like someone doesn't have a concept of God, but they're just a terrible person. Generally, they like beat their wife, and they're like everyone they meet. Like, is that resistance? Possibly. Another way might be if it's resistance, not necessarily. So there was the distinction between de dicto belief and de re belief. So suppose that they're resistant not to Yahweh or the Trinity or to God is God, but they're resistant to the source of moral authority, or something like that, or the kind of the ground of morality or the ground of truth. Suppose they're like resistant in that way. They could still be resistant to that and then be resistant overall. So they wouldn't need to have the concept of God if they're being resistant towards that. Another way might be that they're resistant to similar kinds of things. So if I've got the notes from what's his name, Brian Leftout here, and he talks about the idea of suppose that there's a 16th century racist and he's never heard of a Chinese person. He never has. Would he be racist towards Chinese people? Probably. So because he's like a Chinese person, and it's just that the particular way in which he's oriented means that he's resistant, and so that's like just because of that. And so those are like three ways which I think, even if you don't have a concept of God, you could still be resistant. And so I just think it's a really difficult case to make that there are non-resistant non-believers. There might be a more interesting question if you then say, okay, suppose that everyone's resistant, then why does God let anyone into a relationship? What does it mean to people who like seek long after God? Like, those are really good questions, so don't get me wrong on that.
All right, so we're coming close to the end here. We've gone already 22 minutes over the mark, and granted we started a little bit late, so we went a little bit longer. But so that we can close out today's discussion, I wanted to open it up to each person just to give some of their concluding thoughts, remarks on the discussion, and then we'll go ahead and bring it to a close. So Blake, if you want to start first, and we'll just go down the line: Blake, Josh, Justin, and then Ben.
Yeah, there's obviously, as in any one of these discussions, especially with four people talking, there's several branches going off. There's any number of directions we could have gone in. I guess there are two things that I want to say. One is that a lot of what's happening seems to depend on this sort of faith in God's would-be resourcefulness for some of the stuff that got brought up today. And in some of the stuff that we've talked about, it seems implausible to me that, maybe for everybody, God could make them freely without violating their free will, make them okay with retributive justice and with forbidding homosexuality. That, this is in the last one we talked about. And that's an example of one that seems implausible to me. But not only is it implausible to me, since the argument depends on there being a way for God to do this, I feel that the burden's on Justin and Ben to prove that this is something that God could bring about, that God could find a way. It seems far from established to me. And I think you can use this type of reasoning, these sort of appeal to possibilities to defend a lot of stuff that shouldn't be, taken to. I mean, I don't take it very seriously, I guess is my personal take on when, God's resourceful, he can do it, he can figure it out. But no, I guess in closing, anyone who's interested in this topic, it's huge. It's absolutely massive, the amount of material that's been published. Again, we've only tapped into, less than 10% of the theodicies even that.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, you have a website, beliefmap.org, right, where people can go and check out the sort of conversations of how it would play out, the different types of responses, the rejoinders to those responses, and so on throughout the entire string. And so you've got that up on your website, and so people can definitely go check that out, beliefmap.org.
Right. If you can imagine a flow chart, I've actually made a flow chart debate map between green and red. So you hear the claim, the evidence, then the response. You get to follow the whole thing out. It feels like having a conversation with someone as you explore the site. And I've got a gigantic divine hiddenness section on it with, I think, over 20 articles that themselves have over 100 little sub pieces of conversation. So you can explore a lot of these theodicies. The bibliography for it's, I think, got 20 plus sources, maybe 50 plus. So
awesome.
Yeah, there's a lot to see, and it's an exciting discussion. And huge thanks for Justin and Ben for doing this with us. And it was fun, and I really appreciate you all.
Cool. Josh, what are your concluding thoughts for today?
Yeah. This is great. I really enjoyed this. And people who don't know, who haven't watched that I was, I'm
dang,
Real Atheoloy page.
Josh, sorry, Josh, you're cutting in and out with your audio. Try it one more time.
Okay, can people hear me now?
Yes. And you cut out again. Josh, we're gonna come back to you. Okay, so let's go to Justin. Let's get his thoughts, and then we'll come back to you at the end.
Sure. So, well, first of all, I want to say thank you to Cameron for hosting this, and for Blake and Josh for joining Ben and I in this discussion. So I think that the hiddenness argument, I have my view on this argument is that it's one of the very few places where it takes divine love seriously, and it takes omnipotence seriously. I think that as a result of taking those seriously, you get a very big and forceful objection here. I lean toward it being a successful argument. I think that when we look at the premises individually, they appear more plausible than not. Obviously, theists are going to have a problem with the conclusion, but whether or not they can find a plausible error in the premises is another question. I also want to second the bringing attention to Blake's website. I think that's a fantastic project that he's working on. And even if you don't agree with his conclusions, he's got a very large list of resources that are incredibly valuable. And I would recommend people on both sides to go there and to check that out. With regard to,
and then for you guys, I mean, I mentioned this at the beginning. You guys host or co-host.
oh, that's right, we do a podcast.
Yeah, Real Atheology.
Oh yeah, we do that.
So it's a podcast called Real Atheology, and what it's focused on is philosophy of religion, and obviously we're both atheists, so we bring that to the table. So the discussion's going to be biased to some degree, right? But we really try and be as fair as we can in our analysis of different arguments. We're only 2 episodes in, really, at this point. But
I was able to listen to the second episode, and I mean, as a theist, I thought it was actually really, really good.
Good.
The things that you guys went through, and sort of Ben's response, and I thought it was a great discussion. So
yeah, our aim is to make it as valuable to theists as it is to atheists, and to
be as charitable to theists. This is the point that we'll admit from our side is not seen enough. There's a lot of hand waving and lack of respect for the serious arguments that theists bring to the table, and we want to distance ourselves from that attitude as much as possible.
Yeah, and so Blake can expect an invitation rather soon, so hope he's ready to be fried.
So, Ben, do you have any concluding thoughts on the argument?
So I would. This is one of those arguments that I actually make a pretty bold claim, and I think this argument is better than most arguments from evil. I think this argument is very forceful because it appeals to very common sense, self-evident truths about love and the nature of perfect love. So if you're like me and you believe that there are these people called non-resistant non-believers, such as former believers, lifelong seekers, and isolated non-theists, those pose a problem when you start with the concept of God. And again, I always want to keep coming back to this concept of perfect love, because I think that it entails the openness that I've been trying to stress a good bit. And God being open to relationship, God sees to it that nothing he does or fails to do puts relationship with himself out of reach for finite persons at that time. And so if people were gonna leave with an analogy, I would want them to leave with Schellenberg's analogy of the light bulb. God would be for non-resistant non-believers like a light bulb. However much the degree of the brightness may fluctuate remains on unless they close their eyes. And so I think that's a really important point, because it's saying that, look, God can back off by dimming the brightness on the light bulb a little bit, but he'll never go completely out. The only way that God would ever, you would be able to close God off from a relationship is if you closed your eyes, if you were culpable in some way of resisting his ever-loving presence. That would be the deepest good that you could experience.
That's actually a really good analogy. I haven't heard that one. So I like that. Yeah, I like that analogy.
Yeah, and it's really shaped how I've thought about this this argument. And if there was another point, it would be to kind of be in direct contrast with what Blake was saying. I don't think you can underestimate the resources of an omnipotent being. I think that being omnipotent is a really important part of this, because with omnipotence, we know that God would have the resources to accommodate the possible consequences of being open, of being a perfectly loving being. And he would make them compatible with the flourishing of all concerned in any relationship that might come between them. And I think if you've followed me this far, I think you have a real problem of divine hiddenness, and it constitutes a powerful reason to believe that no perfectly loving God exists.
So let's go ahead and see, Josh, if you're, let's see if your audio is working now. If you're still there. His mic is still muted. Well, I guess I can share some of my thoughts. So one of the things that is interesting about this argument to me is that...
This is fun.
Okay, there you go, Josh.
Okay.
He made it!
Yay! Happy day. So I'd want to say, people who haven't watched this, or you don't know me, that I am a Justin Schieber groupie. That I think just that like have followed Justin for a while, and like it's kind of hilarious that I like no one knows this, but I like sent Justin a message a couple of years ago being like, oh, you're my favorite atheist apologist and all this kind of stuff, and like because actually that Justin makes a conscious effort, and Ben as well, and so Ben is a lot of respect for both of you, and that really make an effort to be charitable to theists, to present theists at the best arguments they do, those kind of arguments, and they make a real effort to do that, and that's really valuable in a world of Richard Dawkins, in a world of people who just is a kind of callous dismissiveness of arguments for Christianity. That's really, really valuable, and so it's really fun to like be able to chat with you guys about this. Yeah,
Josh,
I would just add that he's a contributor.
But it's almost like we're non-resistant or something.
I would also mention that Josh is a contributor to Real Atheology. He has given us a ton of great content on our Facebook page, and just asked some really great questions and challenged a lot of obviously people come onto our page with a bias for atheism, and we've really appreciated Josh putting pressure, bringing arguments from, really strong arguments from the theistic side.
Sure.
And we're happy to have him on.
So before we go any further, I just wanted to again thank everybody, Blake, Josh, Justin, Ben, for you guys coming on for doing this discussion. I know that there's a lot of preparation that goes into it, especially the week before and even the night before. And so I appreciate you guys taking the time, especially to come on today. And I just wanted to remind listeners that if you're watching this and you've enjoyed the discussion today, you've been enjoying the discussions, visit the website, visit my website, capturingchristianity.com. You can go there, you can check out the blog, and then you can see past discussions and everything that we have going on there. And one thing that I wanted to mention is that I am going to try to organize these sorts of discussions moving forward. I'm going to reach out to Blake and Justin and Ben and Josh, I'm sure in the future, to do future discussions. So if you've enjoyed these, make sure to visit the website. And I don't have any ads on my website or anything like that. So if you guys want to donate and help me financially to make sure that I can do this in my spare time, that would be really appreciated. So if you have any other things that you wanted to ask or just get in touch with me, again, visit the website, capturingchristianity.com. And so, yeah, so I'm going to say thank you guys again for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks again, Blake and Josh.
Much love to you all.
Bye-bye.